The sun filtered softly through the blinds of Sherry Rasmussen's cozy living room as she adjusted a vase of fresh tulips on the coffee table. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a picture-perfect morning in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles. Sherry was the epitome of accomplishment and grace, a 29-year-old nurse admired for her dedication and kindness. Her career as a director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center had earned her accolades, but it was her marriage to John Retton that she considered her greatest joy. John, an upbeat and athletic man, had captured Sherry's heart with his easy smile and genuine warmth. Their bond was a testament to shared dreams and mutual admiration. Yet, beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic life, Sherry couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had crept in since their wedding 6 months earlier. It wasn't the normal adjustments of newlywed life. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite name. That unease took shape one evening at a neighborhood barbecue, where John's old friend Stephanie Lazarus made an unexpected appearance. "Stephanie," John had introduced with a casual wave. "This is Sherry." The handshake that followed lingered just a moment too long. Stephanie's gaze flicked between them, her smile tight and unyielding. Sherry noticed it immediately, but John seemed oblivious. Stephanie's laugh was loud, her voice animated as she recounted old college memories with John, seemingly forgetting that Sherry was even there. Later that evening, Sherry mentioned her discomfort to John. "She seemed overly familiar," she ventured cautiously. John dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "That's just Stephanie. She's always been like that." But Sherry couldn't ignore the subtle tension in Stephanie's presence, the way she leaned too close or brushed John's arm during their conversation. As days turned into weeks, Sherry's unease grew. Stephanie began showing up unexpectedly, always with an excuse. "Just dropping by to borrow a book," she'd say, or "I thought I'd return John's old tennis racket." Each visit seemed harmless enough, but the pattern was unmistakable to Sherry. She confided in her parents, Nels and Loretta, during a dinner visit. "I don't want to seem paranoid, but there's something about her," Sherry admitted, her voice hesitant. Loretta offered a comforting hand, but Nels's brow furrowed with concern. One evening, as Sherry returned home from work, she found an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of her car. Her heart raced as she opened it to reveal a single typed sentence. "You don't belong here." The words were stark and menacing. She clutched the note tightly, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but the neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. Sherry debated whether to tell John. Would he take it seriously, or would he brush it off as a coincidence? She decided against it for the time being, choosing instead to be vigilant. But deep down, she knew this wasn't random. The feeling of being watched, the subtle disruptions to her daily life, they all pointed to something deliberate. As the days passed, Sherry couldn't shake the sensation that her perfect life was being intruded upon. A shadow lurked at the edges of her happiness, growing darker with every passing day. She tried to dismiss it, to focus on her work and her marriage, but the unease remained, a constant undercurrent in her mind. The tulips she had placed on the coffee table earlier that morning now seemed wilted, their petals drooping under an invisible weight. Sherry's unease festered like an unspoken truth, lurking in the corners of her otherwise beautiful life. The note she found under her windshield haunted her thoughts, but she told no one, not even John. She didn't want to seem paranoid, yet every creak in the house, every shadow outside the window after dark, seemed to amplify her growing fear. She began double-checking locks and looking over her shoulder more often than she cared to admit. Stephanie Lazarus, meanwhile, had become an unavoidable presence. What started as occasional visits turned into frequent appearances at John's gym, his workplace, and even their home. Stephanie dropped off some old photos from college, John mentioned one evening, holding up a small envelope. Sherry's chest tightened as he flipped through the pictures, Stephanie's smiling face appearing alongside John's in nearly every shot. "She's just being nostalgic," John said, sensing Sherry's discomfort. "You don't have to worry about her." But Sherry couldn't shake the feeling that Stephanie's nostalgia was more like an intrusion. And the photos felt deliberate, like a subtle claim to a past that Stephanie refused to relinquish. Sherry confided in her father again, this time with more urgency. Over dinner, she described Stephanie's escalating presence. "She's everywhere, Dad," Sherry said, her voice trembling. "It's like she's trying to insert herself back into John's life." Nels leaned forward, his expression grave. "You need to be careful, Sherry," he said. If you feel something's wrong, trust that instinct. Don't ignore it. John, on the other hand, remained oblivious. He didn't notice the subtle hostility in Stephanie's tone when she spoke to Sherry, or the way Stephanie always seemed to make herself the center of attention when they were all together. For him, Stephanie was just an old friend who hadn't fully let go of the past. "She'll get over it," he said one night, brushing off Sherry's concerns yet again. But Stephanie's behavior only grew bolder. During a chance meeting at John's gym, she handed him an envelope and said, "Thought you might want these." Inside were more old mementos, a tennis racket stringer, a faded Polaroid of John and Stephanie at a college formal, and a handwritten note. Some memories are worth holding on to. When John told Sherry about the exchange, she felt her stomach drop. "Why is she still clinging to you?" she demanded. John sighed, frustrated. "It's harmless, Sherry. I don't know what you want me to do. Cut her off completely?" Sherry wanted to say yes, but she knew how it would sound. Controlling, jealous. So instead, she kept quiet, her anxiety simmering beneath the surface. One evening, while Sherry was at work, Stephanie showed up at their house unannounced. "John, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low and insistent. John, taken aback, let her in. The conversation that followed was laced with veiled tension as Stephanie reminisced about their college years. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. John shifted uncomfortably. "Stephanie, that was a long time ago. I'm married now, you know that." Her laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Of course I know, she's great really, but you and I, we had something special, didn't we?" John didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, Stephanie's words hung in the air like a challenge. Later that night, when Sherry returned home, John didn't mention Stephanie's visit. He told himself it wasn't important, that it would only upset Sherry. But the omission added to the invisible distance growing between them. Sherry, sensing something unspoken, didn't press him. She retreated into her thoughts, feeling more isolated than ever. The cracks in their seemingly perfect life widened, each one filled with unspoken fears, unanswered questions, and the relentless presence of someone who refused to stay in the past. For Sherry, the unease was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality that she could no longer ignore. The morning began with a stillness that felt oddly heavy. Sherry stood at the window of her living room, sipping her coffee, the sunlight catching the delicate pattern of her robe. She had decided to take the day off from work, a rare moment of respite in her demanding schedule. The thought of catching up on some reading and household tasks brought a small sense of comfort. But beneath that surface, the unease that had shadowed her for weeks still lingered. John had already left for work, offering Sherry a warm kiss on the forehead as he hurried out the door. "Don't work too hard today," he had joked, his voice light. Sherry had smiled back, but as the door clicked shut behind him, she felt a strange pang of vulnerability. Alone now, the house felt quieter than usual, almost too quiet. She moved about the house, straightening the sofa cushions and sorting through mail on the dining table. The envelope from the mysterious note still sat in the pile, untouched but not forgotten. Sherry considered tossing it out, but something stopped her. The words, typed in stark black letters, flashed in her mind again. "You don't belong here." A sharp knock at the door broke her thoughts. Startled, Sherry froze for a moment. She wasn't expecting anyone, and John hadn't mentioned visitors. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice steady but wary. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. She approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. Her heart raced as she stepped back from the door, trying to make sense of it. Then she heard it, the faint sound of movement coming from the side of the house, the garage. A chill ran down her spine as she quickly moved to lock the back door, her instincts taking over. Before she could reach the handle, the door burst open with a violent force, slamming against the wall. Sherry let out a gasp as a figure charged toward her. The intruder was dressed in dark clothing, their face partially obscured, but the intent in their movements was unmistakable. Sherry fought back. Fueled by fear and adrenaline, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and swung it at the attacker. The vase shattered on impact, sending shards flying across the kitchen. The assailant staggered briefly but recovered quickly, grabbing Sherry by the arm. She twisted and struggled, her nails raking across the attacker's exposed skin. She managed to land a solid kick to their shin, buying herself a precious few seconds to break free. The fight moved into the living room, the chaos leaving a trail of overturned furniture and broken glass. Sherry screamed, her voice piercing through the stillness of the neighborhood. She reached for the phone on the coffee table, but the intruder knocked it out of her hand. She lashed out again, this time sinking her teeth into their arm, a desperate move that would later become a crucial piece of evidence. But the struggle was brutal, and the attacker overpowered her. Sherry fell back onto the carpet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The assailant pulled a firearm, their movement swift and deliberate. Sherry's eyes widened in terror as she raised her hands in a final act of defense. 3 deafening shots rang out, shattering the silence. The room fell still once again, but now, the quiet was suffocating. The air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder, mingling with the faint floral aroma of the tulips still perched on the coffee table, a haunting reminder of the morning's fragile normalcy. Sherry's lifeless body lay amidst the wreckage of the living room, a stark and tragic contrast to the peace she had sought that day. Outside, the faint hum of a car engine started up and the vehicle sped away down the street. The intruder was gone, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would shock everyone who entered the home that day. And for Sherry Rasmussen, the morning of quiet plans had turned into the unthinkable, a violent and senseless tragedy. The house was eerily quiet when John Ruetten pulled into the driveway that evening. The faint glow of the living room lights spilled out through the curtains, giving no indication of the horror that awaited inside. John, exhausted from a long day at work, stepped out of his car, his mind drifting to the dinner plans Sherry had mentioned the night before. But as he approached the front door, something felt off. The door wasn't fully closed. It rested slightly ajar, the edge pressing against the latch. John frowned. Sherry never left the door unlocked, let alone open. "Sherry?" he called out, stepping inside. His voice echoed through the hallway, met only by silence. The living room hit him like a physical blow. Furniture was overturned, glass shards littered the floor, and the faint scent of flowers mingled with something metallic, something he couldn't quite place. "Sherry?" His voice cracked, panic creeping into his chest. Then he saw her. Sherry lay crumpled on the carpet, her body unnaturally still. A dark stain had pooled beneath her, seeping into the once pristine beige fibers. John froze, unable to process what he was seeing. His knees buckled as he stumbled toward her, his mind screaming that this couldn't be real. "Sherry!" he cried, his voice breaking. He dropped to his knees, shaking her gently, desperately willing her to wake up. But her skin was cold, lifeless. "No! No, no, no!" The words spilled from him in a choked sob as he pulled her into his arms, the reality sinking in with every agonizing second. She was gone. Amidst his anguish, the disarray of the room began to register in fragments. The smashed coffee table, the overturned vase, the scattered tulips now crushed underfoot. The phone lay a few feet away, its cord stretched taut, as if ripped from her hand mid-call. John's eyes darted around, searching for some explanation, some clue, but all he could see was chaos. He fumbled for the house phone, his shaking fingers struggling to dial 911. The operator's voice was calm, clinical. "What's your emergency?" "It's my wife," John stammered, his breath hitching. She's not breathing. There's blood everywhere. Please send someone. Hurry." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. John knelt beside Sherry, whispering to her through his tears. "I'm so sorry, Sherry. I wasn't here. I should have been here." His voice cracked with guilt, the weight of her absence crushing him. When the first responders arrived, John was ushered outside, his protests ignored as the paramedics and police moved swiftly into the house. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in haunting hues, drawing neighbors to their windows and doorsteps, their whispers filling the air with speculation. One officer approached John, his notepad in hand. "Sir, were you the one who found her?" John nodded, his face pale and drawn. I came home from work. The door was open. I found her like that." The officer's expression was grim. "We'll need to ask you some questions," he said gently, but John barely registered the words. His mind was stuck in a loop, replaying the moment he saw Sherry on the floor. As John sat on the front steps, trembling and staring blankly at the flashing lights, the weight of what he had lost began to settle in. Sherry wasn't just his wife. She was his partner, his confidant, the person who made life brighter. And now, she was gone. Inside the house, investigators were already piecing together the scene. The overturned furniture and missing items pointed to a robbery gone wrong, or so it seemed. But the untouched valuables, the signs of a struggle, and the violent nature of Sherry's death hinted at something far more personal. The seeds of doubt were already taking root, though no one dared voice them yet. John's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the envelope of photos Stephanie had given him not long ago. He hadn't thought much of them at the time, but now an unsettling feeling crept into his chest. Something about the way Stephanie had looked at him during their last conversation lingered in his mind, a shadow he couldn't shake. The sound of the police radio crackled faintly as officers moved through the crime scene, marking evidence and taking photographs. Outside, John sat slumped on the front steps, his hands gripping his hair as if holding his head together was the only way to stay upright. Sherry's death had unraveled the seams of his life in an instant, but amidst the devastation, a strange and unsettling narrative began to emerge. Two detectives approached John, their expressions guarded but professional. "Mr. Ruetten, we understand this is a difficult time, but we need to ask you some questions," one of them began. John nodded absently, his red-rimmed eyes fixed on the ground. "Did Sherry mention anything unusual recently? Anyone she was worried about?" John hesitated. His mind flashed back to the conversations he had brushed off, the moments when Sherry had voiced her concerns about Stephanie Lazarus. "No," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Nothing like that." Inside the house, the investigation seemed to confirm the initial theory, a robbery gone wrong. A few drawers had been ransacked, and Sherry's BMW was missing. But Nels Rasmussen, who had arrived moments after hearing the news, wasn't convinced. "This doesn't make sense," he told one of the detectives, his voice steady despite the anguish etched on his face. Sherry wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. If this was a random break-in, why did they use this level of violence? And why didn't they take more valuables? The detective glanced at him sympathetically but remained non-committal. "We're looking into every possibility," he assured. But Nell's instincts told him otherwise. He pulled John aside, his voice low but firm. "Has Stephanie been around lately?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. John flinched, his breath hitching. "Dad, don't do this right now," he whispered harshly, his guilt bubbling just beneath the surface. But Nels wasn't deterred. "You need to be honest with yourself, John. Sherry told us she felt unsafe, and she mentioned Stephanie by name. This can't be a coincidence." Back at the precinct, the detectives sifted through the evidence. The details didn't fully align with the robbery theory. Jewelry and cash were untouched, and the sheer brutality of the attack seemed personal. "It feels like overkill for a random break-in," one of the detectives remarked, tapping his pen against his notepad. "But there's no sign of forced entry through the front. Maybe she surprised the burglar." Meanwhile, Nels grew increasingly frustrated with the direction of the investigation, or lack thereof. He knew his daughter. Sherry was careful, methodical, and strong-willed. The idea that she was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time didn't sit right. "She fought back," he muttered to Loretta later that evening. "You can see it in the way the furniture's knocked over. Whoever did this had a reason, and it wasn't just to steal." Loretta placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "But they're not listening, Nels," she whispered. "They're not even asking the right questions." John, still reeling, couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. He replayed his last encounter with Stephanie in his mind, the photos, the nostalgic tone of her voice, and that final, lingering question. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" At the time, he had dismissed it as wistfulness. Now it felt heavier, more deliberate. As the days stretched on, LAPD held fast to their theory, citing the missing car as proof of a botched burglary. But when Sherry's BMW was found days later, abandoned and wiped clean of prints, even the detectives couldn't deny the puzzle was missing crucial pieces. Nels pressed harder, insisting they investigate Stephanie Lazarus. "She's LAPD," he argued. "She had access, she had motive, and Sherry knew she was a threat." But each time her name came up, it was dismissed without consideration. "We have no evidence tying her to the scene," the lead detective explained curtly. "We can't accuse someone based on a hunch." The denials only deepened Nels's resolve. He vowed to find answers, even if it meant challenging the very system that seemed determined to overlook the obvious. As he stared at a photo of Sherry from her wedding day, her radiant smile frozen in time, he whispered to himself, "I won't let them forget you." The dimly lit precinct buzzed with routine activity, but behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. Detectives pored over the Rasmussen case files, their discussions laced with frustration. "It doesn't add up," one muttered, flipping through photographs of the crime scene. "This level of violence, it's not what you'd expect from a random burglary." Yet, Despite the doubts swirling within the team, the case remained frozen in the official narrative, a robbery gone wrong. The name Stephanie Lazarus, which Nels Rasmussen had adamantly brought to their attention, was conspicuously absent from their reports. To question one of their own, a respected LAPD officer, was a line few were willing to cross. In the Rasmussen household, the cracks in the investigation were glaringly obvious. Nels paced the living room, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "They're not even trying," he said, his voice sharp with anger. Loretta, seated on the couch with a photo album in her lap, looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "What are we supposed to do, Nels? They won't listen to us." Nels clenched his fists, the helplessness gnawing at him. "Then we make them listen." Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus carried on with her life as if nothing had happened. She smiled at her colleagues, joked during coffee breaks, and handled her cases with the same competence that had earned her respect over the years. But beneath her composed exterior, small cracks began to show. She avoided eye contact when Sherry's case came up in passing conversation and grew tense when questioned about her whereabouts on the day of the murder. Whispers started circulating within the precinct. A junior officer, overhearing a conversation between detectives, leaned in and asked, "Why haven't we looked into that Lazarus angle? Didn't the family bring her up?" His superior shot him a warning glance. "That's above your pay grade. Drop it." This wasn't the first time someone had hinted at Stephanie's potential involvement, but each time, the subject was quickly buried. Whether it was loyalty to a colleague or fear of tarnishing the department's reputation, the LAPD seemed intent on shielding Stephanie from scrutiny. Back at the Rasmussen home, Nels wasn't about to let the case fade into obscurity. He reached out to every contact he had, even enlisting the help of an old friend who had connections in the media. "If they won't investigate her," Nels said firmly, "then we'll make sure everyone knows her name." The pressure mounted, and Stephanie's composed demeanor began to crack. One afternoon, she confronted John in a parking lot, her voice low and urgent. "Why is your father-in-law dragging my name into this?" she demanded, her eyes flashing. John, caught off guard, stammered, I don't know, Stephanie. He's just looking for answers." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "Well, he's looking in the wrong place," she snapped before storming off. But Nels wasn't backing down. He compiled every piece of information he could find on Stephanie, her relationship with John, her uninvited visits, and her history of confrontations with Sherry. Each detail painted a picture of someone who had motive and opportunity, yet the LAPD refused to even question her. "Why?" Loretta asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why won't they investigate her?" Nels didn't have an answer, but deep down, he suspected the truth. Stephanie wasn't just any officer, she was one of them, and protecting their own seemed to outweigh the pursuit of justice. At the precinct, one detective couldn't shake the feeling that the case was being deliberately mishandled. "What if we're missing something big?" he asked his partner one evening. His partner sighed, his expression weary. "You know how it works. Some doors aren't meant to be opened." But those doors were about to be forced open, whether the LAPD liked it or not. As Nels prepared to take his fight to the next level, the shadows of a cover-up began to shift. The truth was there, buried under layers of denial and deflection. And Nels was determined to bring it into the light. Months turned into years, and the once buzzing investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder faded into silence. The LAPD officially labeled the case as cold, shelving it alongside countless other unresolved files. For the Rasmussen family, it felt like a second betrayal, this time not by the killer, but by the system meant to deliver justice. Nels Rasmussen stared at the folders spread across his dining table, the pages filled with his handwritten notes and photocopied police reports. Each line felt like a dead end. Despite his relentless pursuit, the same doors remained firmly shut. "They just don't care," he muttered under his breath, the weight of his failure pressing heavily on his shoulders. Loretta placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You've done everything you could, Nels," she said softly, her voice trembling, but Nels shook his head. "No," he said firmly, his voice laced with frustration. "Not yet." The years hadn't dulled his conviction. Every so often, he would call the precinct, asking if there had been any updates. The answers were always the same. "Sorry, Mr. Rasmussen, there's nothing new to report." But Nels knew better. The truth was, no one was looking. John Ruetten tried to move forward, but the shadow of Sherry's death lingered over him. He sold their home, unable to bear the memories of that terrible day. But the guilt followed him, a constant reminder of the questions he hadn't asked, the warnings he hadn't heeded. He buried himself in work, trying to outrun the past, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus continued her rise within the LAPD. Promotions came steadily, her reputation as a diligent and reliable officer shielding her from any lingering whispers about Sherry's case. For Stephanie, the past was buried, securely locked away in the cold case files that no one dared reopen. But for Nels, giving up was never an option. Every anniversary of Sherry's death reignited his determination. He would sit in his study, poring over old case notes, highlighting discrepancies and inconsistencies, the broken timeline, the untouched valuables, the violent nature of the attack. It all pointed to something deeply personal. And yet, the LAPD remained steadfast in their original conclusion: a botched burglary. "What about that bite mark?" he demanded during one particularly heated phone call with the detectives. "You have DNA now. Why haven't you tested it?" The response was a practiced deflection. "The case hasn't been prioritized for further analysis, Mr. Rasmussen." The bureaucracy was suffocating. Without outside pressure or new evidence, Sherry's case remained at the bottom of the pile, but Nels refused to let it stay there. He began contacting advocacy groups, cold case experts, and even journalists, hoping someone, anyone, would take an interest. "My daughter deserves better than this," he told one reporter. "We deserve better than this." Behind closed doors, whispers within the LAPD hinted at something more insidious. Younger officers, curious about the unresolved case, occasionally stumbled across details that didn't add up. But when they voiced their concerns, they were met with a chilling response. "That's old news, drop it." One officer, braver than the rest, confided in a colleague, "You ever wonder why Stephanie Lazarus's name keeps coming up in connection to that case?" The colleague froze, then looked around nervously. "Watch what you're saying," he warned. "Some things are better left alone." Despite the resistance, Nels continued his crusade. He attended public forums, confronted LAPD leadership, and spoke at victim advocacy events. Each time, his message was the same: "My daughter's life mattered. Someone needs to reopen this case." Unbeknownst to him, his efforts were beginning to bear fruit. A journalist who had attended one of his speeches started digging into Sherry's story, uncovering unsettling details that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. The bite mark, the missing gun, the broken connections. They were all pieces of a puzzle that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The seeds of doubt were growing, and the walls of silence surrounding Sherry's case were beginning to crack. But for now, the file remained in the cold case archives, waiting for the moment when truth would no longer be denied. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the LAPD's cold case unit, a shift was quietly underway. The Rasmussen case file, long buried under layers of dust and neglect, had been reopened, not by chance, but by persistence. Nels Rasmussen's unyielding determination had finally drawn the attention of a team willing to revisit what others had ignored for decades. Detective Greg Alvarado stood at the edge of a cluttered desk, flipping through the file with a furrowed brow. "A bite mark," he muttered, reading the evidence log. The words leapt off the page, igniting a spark of curiosity. Forensic advancements in DNA analysis had made leaps since 1986. What had once been a smudge of circumstantial evidence could now be the key to unlocking the truth. Alvarado brought the case to his supervisor, cautiously optimistic. "This bite mark, there's viable DNA," he explained. "If we run it through CODIS, we might get a match." His supervisor hesitated, glancing at the name printed on the suspect list, Stephanie Lazarus. "You're opening a can of worms," he warned. But Alvarado was undeterred. "If she's innocent, the test clears her. If she's not, we owe the Rasmussen family answers." The sample was sent to the lab. Days stretched into weeks, the waiting punctuated by restless anticipation. Nels, informed of the development, clung to hope as if it were a lifeline. "This is it," he told Loretta, his voice wavering with equal parts fear and determination. "This has to be it." The breakthrough came on a cold afternoon in February 2009. Alvarado's phone buzzed, the caller ID showing the forensic lab. He answered quickly, his voice tight with expectation. "Detective Alvarado speaking." "We've got a match," the technician said, their tone cautious but firm. "The DNA from the bite mark. It's Stephanie Lazarus." For a moment, Alvarado was silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. He had prepared for this possibility, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Thanks, he said finally, his voice steady. But as he hung up, a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. This was no longer a theory. It was proof. The precinct buzzed with quiet whispers as word spread. Lazarus, a decorated detective, had built her career within these walls. The idea that one of their own could be implicated in a murder sent shockwaves through the department. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. Alvarado met with his team, laying out the next steps. This won't be easy, he admitted. We're not just pursuing a suspect, we're pursuing one of our own. We need to tread carefully. Meanwhile, Nels received the call he had been waiting for. We have a lead, Alvarado told him, careful not to reveal too much. But Nels didn't need details to understand the significance. For the first time in decades, he felt the faint glimmer of justice within reach. Thank you, he said, his voice breaking. Thank you for not forgetting her. Inside the LAPD, the tension was palpable. Stephanie Lazarus continued her work as if nothing had changed, oblivious to the walls closing in around her. But her colleagues' glances lingered a second too long. Their conversations quieted when she walked by. The weight of suspicion, once non-existent, began to settle heavily over her. One evening, as Alvarado prepared to leave the office, he found himself staring at the crime scene photos of Sherry Rasmussen. Her face, frozen in a moment of terror, was a haunting reminder of why this pursuit mattered. He made a silent vow, to her, to her family, that this time, justice would not be denied. Behind the scenes, plans were set in motion. Surveillance was quietly arranged, Lazarus's routines meticulously documented. Every detail was scrutinized, every action analyzed. The net was tightening, and Stephanie Lazarus, for all her years of evasion, had no idea the storm that was about to engulf her. The clock on the wall ticked with a steady rhythm, but the tension in the cold case office was anything but calm. Detective Greg Alvarado reviewed the surveillance plan once more, ensuring every detail was perfect. Stephanie Lazarus, a veteran LAPD detective, had spent years building her reputation as a sharp, reliable officer. But now, with DNA evidence tying her to Sherry Rasmussen's murder, she had become the focus of an investigation that could shatter the department. We move carefully, Alvarado said to his team. If she even suspects we're onto her, this could blow up in our faces. Stephanie carried on with her life, her days filled with routine police work, unburdened, or so it seemed. She handled cases with her usual efficiency, cracking jokes with colleagues during lunch breaks. But under the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Her tone sharpened when discussing the Rasmussen case, and she avoided eye contact when certain names were mentioned. Surveillance began subtly. Detectives parked an unmarked car near Stephanie's home, documenting her comings and goings. At first it was monotonous, trips to the grocery store, early morning jogs, late nights at the precinct, but Alvarado knew patience was key. She's too smart to slip up easily, he told his partner, but everyone has blind spots. One evening a breakthrough came. Stephanie was seen retrieving a small box from a storage unit she had rented years earlier. The team watched from a distance, cameras trained on her every move. The box's contents remained a mystery, but her nervous glances over her shoulder spoke volumes. She's hiding something, Alvarado murmured. In the following days, Stephanie's behavior grew more erratic. She called in sick to work, a rarity for someone known for her dedication, and canceled plans with colleagues. Detectives tracked her movements, noting a late-night drive to an isolated area near Griffith Park. She stayed in her car for over an hour, her silhouette visible against the dim glow of the dashboard. What is she doing? One of the surveillance officers whispered. Stephanie's phone records revealed another layer of intrigue. She had placed several calls to an old college friend, someone who hadn't been in her life for years. The conversations were brief, but the timing raised eyebrows. It's like she's reaching out to someone who knows too much, Alvarado theorized. As the net tightened, Stephanie seemed to sense the invisible pressure closing in. At work, she grew more withdrawn, her once confident demeanor replaced by subtle paranoia. She began taking longer lunches, often alone, and avoided the precinct's shared spaces. Her colleagues noticed the shift, but chalked it up to stress. Even the best of us crack under pressure, one officer remarked. They had no idea how true those words were. The tipping point came when Stephanie made a bold move. Surveillance captured her visiting the LAPD evidence room, requesting files related to the Rasmussen case. She's trying to see what we have on her, Alvarado said, his voice tight with urgency. The team acted quickly, ensuring their trail was untraceable. Every move Stephanie made only strengthened their case. One night, as Stephanie returned to her home, she found herself hesitating before unlocking the door. She turned slowly, scanning the darkened street behind her. The shadows felt heavier, the silence louder. It was as if she knew someone was watching, but no one revealed themselves. The surveillance team had mastered the art of invisibility, leaving Stephanie to grapple with the growing weight of her own paranoia. Inside the precinct, Alvarado and his team prepared for the next phase. The evidence was damning, but arresting a fellow officer required an airtight case. "We're almost there," Alvarado said, his determination unshakable. "But we can't rush this. Not with her." Stephanie Lazarus, once a respected figure within the LAPD, now stood on the precipice of her carefully constructed world collapsing. The walls were closing in, and for the first time she felt the suffocating grip of fear. The morning broke crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the walls of the LAPD. Stephanie Lazarus arrived at work, her demeanor outwardly calm, but her movements betrayed a subtle unease. She had noticed the lingering glances, the whispers that stopped abruptly as she entered the room. Something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Detective Greg Alvarado and his team were ready. The arrest plan had been crafted meticulously. Every contingency considered, every potential misstep accounted for. Stephanie's status as a decorated officer complicated the process. "We're not just arresting a suspect," Alvarado reminded his team. "We're dismantling a reputation." By 9 a.m., the stage was set. Stephanie was called into an internal briefing, a routine occurrence in her role as a detective. She walked into the conference room with her usual confidence, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights, but the room's atmosphere felt off. Her colleagues avoided eye contact, their faces blank. "Stephanie Lazarus?" Alvarado's voice cut through the air like a knife. She turned, her brow furrowing at the unfamiliar tone. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "We need to speak with you regarding an ongoing investigation," Alvarado replied, his expression unreadable. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, their presence unmistakably authoritative. For a moment, Stephanie froze. The weight of the situation crashed down on her, but she recovered quickly. "An investigation?" she repeated, forcing a laugh. "What does that have to do with me?" Alvarado's response was cold, deliberate. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen." The room seemed to tilt as Stephanie's face paled. "This is a joke," she said, her voice rising. "You can't be serious!" Her colleagues shifted uncomfortably, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "It's not a joke," Alvarado said firmly. "We have DNA evidence tying you to the crime scene. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Stephanie's mask cracked, panic flashing in her eyes. "You're making a mistake," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I didn't do anything." But the officers moved forward, their actions swift and precise. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Stephanie's protest turned frantic. "You're ruining my life!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the hallway as she was led out of the building. Outside, the precinct was quiet, the usual bustle momentarily stilled by the sight of one of their own being escorted to a squad car. Officers watched from windows and doorways, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Stephanie's reputation had been a shield for so long that seeing it shattered felt surreal. As she was driven to the holding facility, Stephanie's mind raced. The evidence. What had they found? How had they connected her to a case she thought was buried? Her confidence, once unshakable, crumbled under the weight of the reality closing in around her. At the station, Alvarado sat down with his team, a sense of grim accomplishment settling over them. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We still have to make the case airtight." But the arrest itself was a victory, a moment that marked the turning point in a decades-long fight for justice. Meanwhile, Nels Rasmussen received the call he had been waiting for. The detective's voice on the other end was steady but carried an undercurrent of satisfaction. "We've arrested Stephanie Lazarus," Alvarado informed him. Nels's grip on the phone tightened as a wave of emotion washed over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with relief. After all these years, the pieces were finally falling into place. But as much as the arrest brought a sense of validation, Nels knew the road ahead would be long. The fight for justice wasn't over yet. As Stephanie sat alone in the interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the metal table, she stared at her reflection in the one-way mirror. The life she had built, the carefully constructed facade, had been stripped away in an instant, and for the first time she realized there was no way out. The courtroom was packed, a tense buzz filling the air as people whispered about the defendant sitting stoically at the defense table. Stephanie Lazarus, once a decorated LAPD detective, was now on trial for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The case had become a media sensation, the story of betrayal and hidden truths captivating the public's imagination. Nels Rasmussen sat in the gallery, his face a mixture of resolve and sorrow. Loretta sat beside him, clutching a tissue, her hands trembling. For them, this trial was not just about justice, it was about Sherry. Every detail brought up in court, every piece of evidence presented, felt like a window into the final moments of their daughter's life. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. This was not a random act of violence, the lead prosecutor began, his voice steady but firm. This was a calculated, deliberate murder carried out by someone who knew the victim personally and who harbored resentment toward her. DNA evidence was the cornerstone of the case. The prosecution meticulously detailed how the bite mark on Sherry's arm, preserved for over 2 decades, had matched Stephanie Lazarus's DNA. A forensic expert took the stand explaining the process to the jury. The likelihood of this DNA belonging to anyone other than the defendant is 1 in several billion, the expert stated confidently. Stephanie's defense team attempted to poke holes in the evidence, suggesting contamination or procedural errors. This case is built on circumstantial evidence and flawed science, the defense attorney argued. The prosecution wants you to believe a story that's convenient but lacks proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But the prosecution countered with motive. Witnesses testified about Stephanie's obsession with John Ruetten, her uninvited visits to his home, and her confrontations with Sherry. A former colleague even recounted an offhand remark Stephanie had made years ago. She said something like, "If I can't have him, no one can." The colleague testified, her voice uneasy. The courtroom murmured at the revelation. John Ruetten was called to the stand, his demeanor somber as he recounted his relationships with both women. "I never imagined it would come to this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Sherry was my wife. She deserves so much more than this." The trial reached its emotional peak when Nels Rasmussen took the stand. His voice wavered as he described the anguish of losing his daughter and the years of fighting for justice. "Sherry wasn't just a victim," he said, looking directly at the jury. "She was a person, a daughter, a wife, a friend. And for 23 years, her voice was silenced. But we're here today because her life mattered." As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented damning evidence about Stephanie's actions in the aftermath of the murder. Her gun, reported stolen shortly after the crime, matched the ballistics of the weapon used. The staging of the crime scene, made to look like a burglary, was described in detail. "This wasn't a crime of passion," the prosecutor declared. "It was premeditated." The defense attempted to shift focus, arguing that the LAPD's internal investigation was biased and pointing to other unresolved cases as examples of negligence. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The jury's expressions grew grimmer with each passing day, their silence speaking volumes. Finally, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the moment arrived. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in trembling hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Stephanie Lazarus, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Stephanie's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. Nels exhaled sharply, tears streaming down his face as Loretta clung to him, sobbing. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost no family should have to bear. As the courtroom emptied, Nels lingered, staring at the judge's bench. "We did it, Sherry," he whispered. "We finally did it." The day Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced, the courtroom held its breath, each word from the judge carrying the weight of decades of grief, betrayal, and finally, justice. "Stephanie Lazarus, for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen, you are hereby sentenced to 27 years to life in prison," the judge declared, his voice steady but unyielding. Gasps rippled through the room, a mix of relief and finality settling over the space. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen sat at the edge of their seats, their hands tightly clasped together. For over 2 decades they had fought tirelessly, enduring heartache and systemic indifference to reach this moment. As the sentence was handed down, Nels closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "It's over," he whispered, though the ache in his heart reminded him that some wounds never fully heal. Stephanie remained composed as she was led out of the courtroom, her face an emotionless mask. But inside, her world had crumbled. The reputation she had so carefully cultivated was now irrevocably destroyed, and the walls of her prison would soon become the physical manifestation of the guilt she had carried all these years. The silence she left in her wake felt heavier than her presence ever had. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the Rasmussen family, their cameras and microphones thrust forward in a cacophony of questions. "How do you feel now that justice has been served?" one journalist asked. Nels paused, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't about us feeling good," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "It's about Sherry. She deserved justice, and today, she finally got it." The aftermath of the trial reverberated throughout the LAPD. The arrest and conviction of one of their own sparked a wave of introspection within the department. Policies were scrutinized, and changes were proposed to prevent similar oversights in the future. But for many officers, the betrayal cut deeply. "She was one of us," one colleague admitted. "To think she used her badge to hide from the truth, it's sickening." For John Ruetten, the verdict was bittersweet. He had loved Sherry, but his inability to protect her from the darkness that ultimately claimed her life haunted him. After the trial, he made a quiet visit to her gravesite, bringing with him a single white rose. Standing there in the stillness, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Sherry. I hope you know how much you meant to me." The Rasmussen family worked tirelessly to ensure Sherry's legacy extended beyond the courtroom. They established a scholarship in her name for nursing students determined to honor the compassion and brilliance that had defined her life. "She cared about helping people," Loretta said during the scholarship's announcement, "and now she'll continue to make a difference, even if she's no longer here with us." Years later, the case would be studied in law enforcement academies as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of bias, complacency, and the failure to listen to the voices of those who refuse to give up. For cold case detectives, it became a symbol of hope, proving that even the most elusive truths can eventually come to light. Nels often reflected on the journey that had consumed so much of his life. Sitting on his porch, he would glance at a framed photograph of Sherry, her radiant smile frozen in time. "We didn't let her be forgotten," he would say to himself, his voice filled with quiet resolve, "and we never will." Justice had been delivered, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with unwavering determination. For the Rasmussens, it wasn't closure. The loss of Sherry was a wound that time would never fully heal. But in her name, they found purpose, strength, and the will to keep moving forward. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus sent shockwaves far beyond the Rasmussen family. The LAPD, an institution built on trust and accountability, faced an unprecedented reckoning. For years, Stephanie had walked the halls of the department as a decorated officer, her dark secret shielded by her badge. Now her crime became a symbol of what could happen when systemic flaws went unchecked. Inside the department, the mood was somber. Officers who had once worked alongside Stephanie found themselves questioning everything. "How did we miss this?" one detective asked his partner, the frustration evident in his voice. "We trusted her. She was one of us." But others admitted what had long been whispered. The signs had been there. "She was aggressive," another officer confided, speaking on the condition of anonymity, not just in her work, but in how she dealt with people. "Looking back, it's like she was always trying to prove something, like she had something to hide." The case spurred an internal review, and the findings were grim. The original investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder had been riddled with oversights and biases. Evidence had been ignored, leads dismissed, and the suspicions raised by Nels Rasmussen had been brushed aside. "We failed," an LAPD spokesperson admitted during a press conference. "Not just the Rasmussen family, but the community we are sworn to protect." Public trust in the LAPD wavered as questions mounted. How many other cases had been mishandled? How many other victims had been denied justice? Advocacy groups called for sweeping reforms, demanding greater transparency and accountability. "This isn't just about one rogue officer," a prominent activist declared. "It's about a system that allowed her to thrive." For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the fallout was bittersweet. They had fought for justice for Sherry, but the price had been steep. "It's hard to celebrate when you know this could have been avoided," Nels said in an interview. "We told them about Stephanie from the beginning. We trusted them to do their job, but they didn't listen." The ripple effects of the case reached the courtroom as well. Stephanie's conviction set a precedent for re-examining cold cases, particularly those involving law enforcement personnel. This case proves that no one is above the law, a district attorney commented, and it highlights the importance of revisiting the past with fresh eyes and new tools. For the Rasmussen family, the aftermath became a mission. They channeled their grief into advocacy, speaking at events and pushing for legislative changes to strengthen oversight within law enforcement. Sherry's name became a rallying cry for reform, her story a reminder of the cost of complacency. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus began serving her sentence in a maximum security prison. Her once proud career was reduced to a footnote in a case that would haunt the LAPD for years to come. She rarely spoke to anyone, her silence a stark contrast to the commanding presence she had once exuded. The walls of her cell bore witness to the weight of her choices, each day a reminder of the life she had stolen and the trust she had betrayed. But justice, though long delayed, brought a measure of peace to those who had fought for it. John Ruetten, now remarried, found solace in honoring Sherry's memory quietly. He visited her grave on the anniversary of her death, leaving a bouquet of her favorite flowers. "You'll always be part of me," he whispered, the words carried away by the breeze. The LAPD, scarred but resolute, implemented changes designed to prevent another case like Sherry's. Training programs were overhauled, protocols were tightened, and a new generation of officers vowed to learn from the mistakes of the past. And for Nels and Loretta, the fight for Sherry's justice became their legacy. In her name, they built something enduring, a foundation dedicated to supporting families of cold case victims. "Sherry taught us to stand up for what's right," Loretta said during the foundation's opening ceremony. "And through her, we've learned that even in the darkest times, hope can endure." The ripples of Sherry Rasmussen's story continued to spread, touching lives and changing systems. Her name became more than a memory. It became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of truth, and a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still prevail. What do you think of Stephanie Lazarus and the shocking twists in this case? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy unraveling real-life mysteries and compelling true crime stories, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.